The moment I saw the amount on that bank slip, I knew someone in my family was lying to me. I have always been the kind of woman who notices small things, the kind that other people brush off, and after living 68 years in this world, raising a son on my own after my husband passed, and stretching every dollar until it nearly tore in half, I learned that money has a way of telling the truth even when people don't, and that morning, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold in my hand, I stared at the number printed neatly on the paper and felt something deep in my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt in years, because it wasn't just smaller than usual, it was wrong in a way that didn't make sense, not with my son Daniel, not with the careful, consistent man I raised him to be, and certainly not with the promises he made to me when he insisted on helping me out after I retired, telling me every single month without fail that he would make sure I never had to worry about bills again, that I had done enough worrying for one lifetime, and for the past 2 years, he had kept that promise down to the dollar, down to the date, always arriving on the 3rd of the month like clockwork, except this time it came late and lighter, and what unsettled me most wasn't even the missing amount but the quiet little note printed under the transaction that said it had been processed differently, through a method Daniel had never used before, and I sat there longer than I care to admit, tracing that line with my finger like it might suddenly explain itself. But it didn't, and I told myself there had to be a simple explanation, because there always is, because families don't just suddenly start hiding things from each other. At least that's what I used to believe, so I folded the slip carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and decided I would ask about it that evening when I went over for dinner. Just a simple question, nothing more, because I have never been the kind of mother who accuses without reason, and I wasn't about to start now, not with my own son's home, the same home I helped him buy by dipping into my savings years ago when he and Olivia were just starting out, the same home where I used to feel welcome the moment I stepped through the door, greeted by the smell of something warm cooking and Olivia's bright voice calling out hello. And as I drove over that evening, I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was probably just a banking error, or maybe Daniel had switched accounts, something practical, something harmless. But when I pulled into their driveway and saw Olivia already standing at the door as if she had been watching for me, something about the way she held herself, stiff and too still, sent a quiet warning through me that I couldn't ignore, and I smiled anyway, because that's what you do when you walk into your family's home. You bring warmth with you even if you're carrying questions, and she smiled back, but it didn't quite reach her eyes the way it used to, and for the first time, I felt like a guest instead of a mother. Like I was stepping into a place where something had shifted just slightly out of place, the kind of shift that most people might miss but not me, not anymore. And as we sat down at the table, Daniel talking about work, Olivia nodding along a little too quickly, I waited, listening, watching, letting the rhythm of their voices settle before I spoke, because timing matters more than words sometimes. And when I finally set my fork down and looked up with what I hoped was a gentle expression, I said, "Daniel, honey, did something change with the money you've been sending me?" And it was the simplest question in the world, the kind that should have been answered with a simple explanation, a quick reassurance, maybe even a laugh, but instead, the air in that room seemed to freeze, and before Daniel could even open his mouth, Olivia's chair scraped sharply against the floor as she straightened up, her hand tightening around her glass, and in that split second, before a single word was spoken, I knew with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in my chest that whatever was happening here, it wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't small. Olivia did not answer right away, and that silence stretched longer than it should have, long enough for Daniel to glance between us with a small, uncertain smile like he was trying to figure out if he had missed something, and I kept my expression calm, my hands folded neatly in front of me, because I had learned a long time ago that the first reaction often tells you more than the words that follow. And when Olivia finally spoke, her voice came out sharper than expected, almost as if my question had offended her, and she said, "Why would anything change?" With a tone that did not match the simple nature of what I had asked, and I felt that same quiet tightening in my chest again, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, and I turned my eyes to Daniel, giving him the chance to answer instead, because this was his promise to me, his responsibility, and he opened his mouth slightly before hesitating, his gaze flickering briefly toward Olivia in a way that did not go unnoticed by me, and that small moment, that single glance, told me more than any explanation could have, and he cleared his throat and said, "No, Mom, everything should be the same." But there was uncertainty there, a hesitation that had never been there before, and I nodded slowly, as if I accepted that answer, even though I did not, and I reached into my purse with steady hands, pulling out the folded bank slip and placing it gently on the table between us, not sliding it, Not pushing it, just setting it there like a simple piece of paper. That happened to carry more weight than it should have, and I said, "It just looks a little different this time, that is all," keeping my voice soft, almost apologetic, because I was not there to accuse anyone, I was there to understand. But Olivia leaned forward quickly, faster than necessary, her hand brushing the edge of the paper as if she wanted to move it out of sight, and she said, "Banks make mistakes all the time, Helen, you know that." And there it was, my name, not Mom, not anything. Warm, just Helen, flat and distant, and I felt that shift settle in more firmly, like something invisible had finally taken shape in the room, and Daniel picked up the paper then, his brow furrowing as he looked at it more closely, and I watched his expression carefully, because whatever he felt in that moment would be real, unfiltered, and I saw confusion there, genuine confusion, and that told me something important, something that made my heart sink even as my mind grew clearer, and he said, "This is not what I sent," almost to himself, and Olivia let out a small laugh that did not sound natural, shaking her head as if the whole situation was being blown out of proportion, and she said, "Maybe you are remembering wrong." But Daniel did not look convinced, and for the first time since I arrived, I saw a crack form between them, a small one but enough, and I stayed quiet then, letting the silence do its work, because sometimes the truth does not need to be forced, it just needs space to surface, and in that space I could feel the balance in that room shifting slowly but unmistakably, and I realized that whatever had been happening with that money, it was not something Daniel fully understood, and that meant only one thing, and I did not need to rush to say it out loud, because the more Olivia tried to smooth it over, the more obvious it became. And as she reached for her glass again, her hand just slightly unsteady now, I knew this was no longer about a simple question, it was about something that had been hidden for far too long, and I had just stepped directly into it. Daniel kept staring at the paper as if it might change the longer he looked at it, his fingers tightening slightly along the edges, and I could see the moment when his confusion started turning into something else, something more focused, more serious, and I had seen that look before. Back when he was younger and trying to piece together a problem he knew did not add up, and it gave me a quiet sense of clarity even as the tension at the table continued to build. And I chose that moment to lean back slightly in my chair, not retreating but giving space, because pushing too hard too soon would only give Olivia something to fight against, and I did not intend to fight, not yet, and Daniel finally looked up, his voice lower now, more deliberate, as he said, "I have been sending the same amount every month, nothing changed on my end." And there was no hesitation in that statement this time, no glance toward Olivia for confirmation, just certainty, and Olivia let out a small sigh, shaking her head as if she was the only reasonable person in the room, and she said, "Then it has to be the bank, I told you these things happen." But the way she avoided looking directly at Daniel now did not go unnoticed, not by him and certainly not by me, and I reached for my glass of water, taking a slow sip, letting the silence stretch just a little longer before I spoke again, keeping my tone even, almost gentle, as if I were discussing something far less important than I knew it was, and I said, "It is just strange because this is not the first time it has looked a little different." And that was not entirely a lie, because while this was the first time I had seen it this clearly, there had been small moments before, small inconsistencies I had brushed aside because I trusted my family, and as soon as those words left my mouth, I saw Olivia's posture stiffen again, her shoulders pulling back as if she were bracing herself, and Daniel turned to her fully now, the paper still in his hand, and asked, "What do you mean, not the first time?" And there it was, the question that shifted everything just a little further, and Olivia gave a quick shrug, too quick, and said, "Maybe she just did not notice before, or maybe she forgot." And that word, forgot, landed heavier than she intended, because I had never been a forgetful woman, and she knew that, and Daniel knew that, and I saw the flicker of discomfort cross his face at that suggestion. And I set my glass down carefully, meeting his eyes instead of hers, because this was not about convincing Olivia anymore. It was about letting Daniel see what was right in front of him, and I said, "I keep records of everything, Daniel, you know that." And his expression shifted again, more serious now, more alert, and I continued, not raising my voice, not accusing, just stating facts the way I always had. "The amounts have been slightly off a few times over the past months. I just thought it was timing or processing delays, but this one is different." And Olivia let out a short laugh under her breath, almost dismissive, but there was a tightness in it now, a strain that had not been there before, and she said, "Helen, you are reading too much into this." And again my name, flat and cold, and I did not respond to that directly, because sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all, and instead I looked at Daniel and said quietly, "I just wanted to make Sure, everything was all right. And that was the truth, at least the part of the truth I was ready to share. And as Daniel looked down at the paper again, then back at Olivia, I could see the shift happening inside him, slow but undeniable, like something he had trusted without question was beginning to crack. And in that moment I realized that whatever had been hidden was no longer fully under control, not for Olivia, not anymore, and I sat there calmly, my hands resting in my lap, my posture steady because I did not need to rush, I did not need to raise my voice. The truth was already starting to surface, and all I had to do was let it. Daniel did not speak right away, and that silence carried more weight than anything that had been said so far, because it was no longer the kind of silence that comes from confusion, it was the kind that comes from thinking carefully, from replaying details in his mind that he had never questioned before, and I watched him as he set the paper down slowly, his fingers lingering on it for just a moment before he pulled his hand back, and then he turned fully toward Olivia, his voice steady but quieter now as he said, "Have you been handling the transfers?" And it was a simple question, but it landed differently this time because it was not asked casually, it was asked with intention, and Olivia shifted in her seat, crossing her arms as if to create a barrier between herself and the rest of us, and she gave a small nod, too controlled, too measured, and said, "Of course I have. I always take care of that kind of thing." And there was something in the way she said always that felt rehearsed, as if she had already decided that was the answer she would give no matter what, and Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to show that he was no longer accepting things at face value, and he asked, "Then why does this not match what I sent?" And for the first time since I arrived, Olivia did not respond immediately, and that hesitation, that brief flicker of uncertainty, was more revealing than any explanation she could have given, and I remained still, my hands folded in my lap, my posture calm, because this was no longer my conversation to lead, it was unfolding on its own now, and Olivia let out a slow breath, shaking her head as if she were the one being put in an unfair position, and she said, "Daniel, you are making this into something it is not. I already told you banks make mistakes." But Daniel did not look convinced, not this time, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her in a way that felt new, as if he were seeing her from a different angle for the first time, and I could feel the shift in the room becoming more solid, more undeniable, and I decided to add just one more piece, not to push but to clarify, and I said softly, "The routing number is different this time." And that detail seemed to land harder than anything else, because Daniel's eyes snapped back to the paper, his expression tightening as he picked it up again, scanning it more carefully, and Olivia's reaction was immediate, her hand moving toward the paper again almost instinctively before she caught herself and pulled it back, and that small movement did not go unnoticed, not by him and certainly not by me, and Daniel's voice dropped slightly as he said, "Why would the routing number be different?" And this time when he looked at Olivia, there was no uncertainty in his gaze, only expectation, and Olivia straightened her posture, lifting her chin just slightly as if she were preparing herself, and she said, "Maybe they changed something on their end, I do not know, I am not the bank." But the edge in her voice had sharpened, the calm she had been trying to maintain slipping just enough to reveal the strain underneath, and I could see Daniel processing that, weighing her words against what he was seeing, what he was remembering, and I knew in that moment that the balance had fully shifted because doubt, once it takes hold, does not easily let go, and I did not need to say anything more, I did not need to press further, because the truth was no longer something hidden behind polite conversation, it was right there in front of us, just waiting for the final piece to bring it fully into the light, and as I sat there, quietly, watching the two of them across the table, I realized that whatever Olivia had been managing so carefully until now was beginning to slip beyond her control, and she knew it, even if she was not ready to admit it yet. Daniel did not look away from Olivia this time, and the way he held that silence made it clear he was no longer willing to accept vague answers, and I could see the tension settling deeper into his shoulders as he waited, giving her the opportunity to explain herself properly, but Olivia only pressed her lips together for a brief second before letting out another breath, longer now, heavier, as if she were the one carrying a burden instead of answering a simple question, and she leaned back slightly, folding her arms tighter across her chest as she said, "I already told you everything I know, you are both overthinking this." And there was a sharpness to her tone that had not been there before, something defensive, something almost irritated, and that shift did not go unnoticed by Daniel, whose expression hardened just enough to show that he was no longer comfortable letting it go, and he said, "Olivia, this is not overthinking, the numbers do not match, and the routing number is different. That is not nothing, and his voice remained calm, but there was a firmness to it now, the kind that comes when someone begins to realize they may have been kept in the dark. And Olivia shook her head again, quicker this time, her composure beginning to show small cracks as she said, "Then call the bank tomorrow and ask them. I do not know what else you want me to say." And for a brief moment the room fell quiet again. But it was no longer the same kind of silence. As before, this one carried weight, suspicion, something unspoken but growing. And I sat there watching carefully, not interrupting, because I could see Daniel thinking, really thinking now. And then he said something that shifted everything just a little further. "I will call them, but I want to understand why this looks like it was rerouted." And that word rerouted seemed to land heavily in the room, and Olivia's reaction was immediate, her posture stiffening, her eyes narrowing just slightly before she quickly looked away, reaching for her glass again. But this time her hand was not as steady as she might have liked, and I noticed it, just like I noticed everything else, and I realized that this was no longer about convincing anyone of anything. The truth was already pushing its way to the surface, piece by piece, and I decided to speak one more time, carefully, deliberately, not accusing but guiding, and I said, "Daniel, the bank slip says the transfer was processed through a secondary account." And that detail seemed to catch him off guard, his eyes widening just slightly as he looked back down at the paper, reading more closely now, and Olivia's voice came quickly after, too quickly, as she said, "That does not mean anything. There are all kinds of processing steps you do not understand." And there it was again, the attempt to dismiss, to minimize, but it felt weaker now, less convincing, and Daniel did not respond right away. Instead he stared at the paper for a few seconds longer before slowly setting it down again. And when he looked up, there was something different in his expression, something more resolved, more focused, and he said, "I think we need to look into this properly." And it was not said loudly, it was not said with anger, but it carried a weight that had not been there before, and Olivia's reaction to that was subtle but unmistakable, her shoulders tightening, her jaw setting just slightly as if she were bracing herself for something she had hoped to avoid. And I remained where I was, calm, composed, my hand still resting quietly in my lap, because I knew that whatever came next did not need to be forced, it would unfold on its own. And as I looked between the two of them, I could see the shift clearly now. The trust that had once been unquestioned was no longer steady, and once that foundation begins to crack, it does not take much for everything built on top of it to start coming apart, and Olivia knew it, even if she had not said a word to admit it, and that was all I needed to understand that this was only the beginning. The rest of the evening moved forward, but not in the way it used to. Not with that easy rhythm of conversation and laughter that once filled their home. Instead everything felt measured, careful, like each word had to be chosen before it was spoken, and I could see Daniel slipping further into his thoughts, quieter than before, responding when spoken to but no longer leading the conversation, and Olivia tried to bring things back to normal, asking about small things, making light comments about work and errands, but there was a strain beneath it all that could not be hidden. And I did not push any more that night because I had already seen enough, I had heard enough, and more importantly, Daniel had started to see it too, and that was what mattered most. So when dinner ended, I thanked them as I always did, standing up slowly, smoothing my coat as I prepared to leave, and Olivia walked me to the door, her smile returning, but it felt practiced now, something placed carefully on her face rather than something that came naturally, and she said, "I am sure this is just a misunderstanding." And I looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, not with anger, not with accusation, just with the quiet understanding that comes when the pieces begin to fall into place, and I said, "I hope so." Because that was all that needed to be said in that moment, and as I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I felt a strange sense of clarity settle over me. Not relief, not yet, but something steadier, something grounded, because uncertainty had been replaced with direction. And as I drove home, I replayed every detail in my mind. Not just from that evening but from the past few months, the small inconsistencies, the slight delays, the subtle changes in tone when money was mentioned, things I had ignored because I trusted my family, and I realized now that trust, while important, should never replace awareness, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew exactly what I needed to do next, and it was not confrontation, not yet, it was confirmation, because I had spent too many years managing my own life to rely on assumptions. And the next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, the house quiet around me, the sunlight just beginning to filter through the kitchen window as I sat down with my coffee and my records, every statement, every note, every detail I had carefully kept over the years, and I laid them out one by one across the table, comparing dates, amounts, looking for patterns, and it did not take long for those patterns to begin revealing themselves. Small differences at first, $10 here, $20 there. Nothing that would immediately raise alarm, nothing that would seem significant on its own. But when placed side by side, month after month, they told a different story, a consistent one, and I felt that same tightness in my chest return, not from confusion this time, but from realization. And I did not rush, I did not let emotion take over. Instead, I reached for the phone, dialing the bank with steady hands, because facts matter, details matter, and I intended to have both before I said another word to anyone. And as I listened to the quiet ringing on the other end, I understood something very clearly. Whatever had been happening was not a mistake. It had been happening for some time, carefully, quietly, and now for the first time I was no longer looking at it as a question. I was looking at it as something that needed to be uncovered completely, no matter where it led. The woman on the other end of the phone spoke in a calm, professional tone, asking me to verify my information before she could discuss the account details, and I answered each question carefully, my voice steady, my mind focused, because this was no longer just a suspicion, it was something that needed clarity. And once everything was confirmed, I explained what I had noticed, the differences in the amounts, the change in routing, the irregularities that had begun to form a pattern, and there was a brief pause on her end, the kind of pause that tells you someone is looking deeper into something, and I sat there quietly, listening to the faint sound of keys tapping in the background, and when she finally spoke again, her tone had shifted just slightly, still polite, still measured, but more precise, more certain, and she said that the transfers had indeed been redirected through an intermediary account before reaching mine. And that detail settled heavily in my chest because it confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, and I asked her, as calmly as I could, if that was something that happened automatically, something the bank might do on its own, and she explained that it was not, that such a change would require authorization from the sending side, and I thanked her, keeping my voice composed even as the implications became clearer. And when I hung up the phone, I did not move right away. I simply sat there, at my kitchen table, looking at the paper spread out in front of me, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel it, not anger, not yet, but a quiet disappointment, the kind that comes when something you trusted begins to show its true shape. And I thought back to every time Olivia had smiled at me, every time she had reassured me that everything was taken care of, and I realized that what I had seen as care might have been something else entirely, something more controlled, more deliberate. And I did not rush to any conclusions beyond what I now knew for certain, because facts were what mattered, and the facts were clear. The money had not been sent directly to me, it had been redirected first, and that redirection had not been random, it had been arranged. And as I gathered my papers, stacking them neatly, I felt that clarity sharpen into something more defined, something purposeful, because now this was no longer about discovering if something was wrong, it was about understanding how far it went and deciding what to do about it. And I reached for my phone again, not to call Daniel, not yet, but to check the dates of his previous transfers, matching them carefully against what I had recorded, and the pattern became even more obvious, consistent adjustments, small enough to go unnoticed at first, but steady enough to add up over time, and that told me everything I needed to know about intent, because mistakes do not repeat themselves so neatly. And I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow breath, letting that realization settle fully, and in that moment, I understood that whatever had been happening was not impulsive, it was calculated, and that meant I would need to be just as deliberate in how I handled it, because this was not just about money anymore, it was about trust, about respect, about the quiet understanding that exists within a family, and once that is broken it cannot simply be brushed aside. And as I looked out the window, watching the sunlight grow stronger across the yard, I knew that the next time I sat across from Olivia, it would not be as someone asking a question, it would be as someone who already knew the answer. I did not wait long before making my next move, because once the truth is clear, hesitation only gives the other person time to prepare, and I had no intention of giving Olivia that advantage, so instead of calling ahead or announcing anything, I simply showed up 2 evenings later at the same time I usually would, carrying a small dessert like I often did, something simple, something familiar, because routine has a way of lowering defenses. And when Olivia opened the door, I saw the flicker of surprise cross her face before she replaced it with that same practiced smile, and she said, "Helen, you should have called." But I just smiled back gently and said, "I was in the neighborhood," even though we both knew that was not entirely true. And as I stepped inside, I could feel it again, that subtle tension beneath the surface, like something unfinished lingering in the air, and Daniel was already in the living room, looking up as I walked in, his expression softening when he saw me, but there was still that underlying seriousness in his eyes, the kind that does not disappear overnight, and we exchanged a few polite words before settling at the table again, the same table where everything had started to shift, and for a while the conversation stayed light, almost carefully so, as if we were all aware that something else was waiting just beneath it, and I let it be that way for a few minutes, giving the moment time to settle because timing matters, and when I finally reached into my bag and placed a small stack of neatly organized papers on the table, I did it calmly, without drama, without urgency, just a simple motion that carried more meaning than any raised voice ever could, and Daniel's eyes immediately moved to the papers, his posture straightening slightly as he understood that this was not a casual visit, and Olivia's reaction was more subtle but no less telling, her smile fading just a fraction, her hand pausing mid-motion before she slowly set down her glass, and I looked at both of them before speaking, my voice steady, clear and controlled, and I said, "I spoke with the bank," and that was all it took for the room to quiet completely, and I continued, not rushing, not accusing, just laying out the facts the way they were given to me. They confirmed that the transfers were redirected through another account before reaching mine, and that kind of change does not happen without authorization from the sender's side. And I watched Daniel closely as I spoke, because this was not about shocking him, it was about allowing him to understand, and I could see the moment the information settled in, his expression tightening, his eyes shifting briefly toward Olivia, before returning to the papers in front of him, and I gently slid them closer to him, each page organized by date, by amount, showing the pattern clearly, consistently, and I said, I compared everything month by month, and I did not need to say more than that, because the evidence spoke for itself, and Olivia let out a quiet breath, but this time there was no quick explanation, no immediate dismissal, just silence, and that silence carried a different kind of weight now, heavier, more exposed, and Daniel picked up the top page, scanning it slowly, carefully, his fingers tightening slightly along the edge, and when he looked up again, his voice was quieter than before, but there was something firm beneath it as he said, "Olivia, is there something you need to explain?" And I did not look at her right away. I let that question sit, let the moment stretch, because sometimes the truth reveals itself best when there is nowhere left to hide, and in that stillness, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by assumptions anymore. It would be shaped by what could no longer be denied. Olivia did not answer immediately, and that silence was no longer defensive or uncertain. It was something heavier, something that carried the weight of being seen, truly seen, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not rush to fill it, she did not try to smooth it over with explanations or dismiss it with a quick remark, she simply sat there, her hands resting on the table, her fingers pressed together tightly as if holding herself steady, and Daniel waited, his eyes fixed on her, not angry, not yet, but searching, and I remained still, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to, because this was no longer about me asking questions, it was about them facing what had been placed between them, and after what felt like a long stretch of quiet, Olivia finally let out a slow breath, her shoulders dropping slightly as if she had decided something internally, and she said, "I was managing the accounts." Her voice softer now, stripped of the sharpness it had before, and Daniel's expression did not change, he only said, "That is not what I asked," and there was a firmness in his tone that made it clear he was no longer willing to accept partial answers, and Olivia closed her eyes briefly before opening them again, looking down at the papers instead of at either of us, and she continued, "I moved some of the money first, just temporarily," and even though her voice remained controlled, there was a slight tremor beneath it now, something that had not been there before, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table as he asked, "Temporarily for what?" And that question hung in the air, direct and unavoidable, and Olivia hesitated again, but this time it was different. This was not hesitation to deflect, it was hesitation because there was no easy way to say what came next, and she said, "For expenses," and it was a vague answer, one that might have worked before, but not now, not with everything laid out so clearly, and Daniel shook his head slowly, his gaze steady as he said, "Then why did you not tell me?" And that question, simple as it was, seemed to carry more weight than anything else, because it was no longer about the money, it was about trust, about the quiet understanding that had been broken without a word. And Olivia finally looked up then, meeting his eyes, and for a brief moment, I saw something real there, not defensiveness, not control, but something closer to uncertainty, and she said, I thought I could handle it without making it a bigger issue. And I listened carefully, not to the words alone, but to what they revealed, and I understood then that this had not been a single decision, it had been a series of choices, each one justified in the moment, each one building on the last until it became something that could no longer be explained away, and Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly as he processed that, his expression no longer confused but not fully settled either, and I knew that this was the moment where everything could turn in different directions, but I also knew my role in it had already been fulfilled, because I had not come here to argue, I had not come here to demand, I had come to bring clarity, and I had done that, and so I reached forward calmly, gathering the papers back into a neat stack, and I said quietly, I did not come here to accuse anyone, I just needed the truth, and my voice remained steady, not cold, not harsh, just certain, and I stood up slowly, giving them both a final look, not of anger but of understanding, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step away once the truth is revealed, and as I moved toward the door, I could feel the weight of what had been uncovered settling into the space behind me, not resolved, not yet, but no longer hidden, and that alone was enough, because once something is brought into the light, it cannot return to the shadows the way it once was.